That's Debatable is sponsored by MB&G. MB&G is specialists in the esoteric world of vehicle and furniture warranty insurance, delivering quite marvellous customer service, prompt claims payment, and a highly developed understanding of how to deliver these products in a way that is both compliant with the regulations and attractive to customers. To find out more, call Paul Smith, the Managing Director, on 07887 501 441. That's 07887 501 441. Hello and welcome to That's Debatable, the weekly news podcast of the Free Speech Union. And welcome back to our listeners and to all of our viewers. And welcome back to you, Jan. We had a fantastic event last week, didn't we, with the talk that was called From Faith to Faithless. We had a fantastic panel of three people who, in their own ways, have gone on that journey. Not quite the third. Dr. Ben Jones, I don't think, was ever faithful. Although he is faithful, obviously, to the Free Speech Union and to all of our members. But he used to work for the National Secular Society. He now works for us, and Ben was one of the panelists. But we also had people who've gone on their own journeys. Terry O'Sullivan, who had been in the Jehovah's Witnesses, and Khadija Khan, who had been a Muslim, and they were talking about what it meant going on that journey, and from a free expression perspective, the response that you get in modern Britain when you leave a high control religion. And I think that term high control, was that Terry's word, Jan? Because I know you worked with Terry on setting up the event, but it was, I think, a word that really summed up and summarized the nub of the issue that we were talking about there.
Yes, it's something that, so Terry O'Sullivan runs the Faith to Faithless support service, which is a sort of subsection of Humanist UK, and it's a expert support service. I think she's been working there since 2015, and they work with people who've left all kinds of religions, and so but everybody who comes to them, it's because they've been part of the most highly controlling parts or dimensions of that particular religion, and some of them might be kind of aberrations from a religion, and some of them might be a cult. So there's all kinds of anybody can come and seek support from them. It was really, I was so pleased with it, because we'd taken a long time to plan that event, and I think the sort of discipline, in a way, of having to consider all religions was actually really good, because we could have gone straight down the motorway of talking about Islam and former Muslims, and that would be relatively easy to do, and obviously lots of people are talking about it all the time. But I think it was really good to continually sort of think about either the similarities or the differences. And so when I was thinking about it afterwards, what came through very strongly was this kind of spectrum of issues that people can face when they leave a religion. So everything from the kind of initial sort of pressure within the religion not to question, and that was described so well by Terry, that within Jehovah's Witnesses, you really are not allowed to question. And it's not just that other people tell you you're not allowed to question, it's that you yourself come to believe that the doubts in your mind about the faith are sinful and are really problematic. And I thought she brought that out really, really well. And so that was very helpful. So it's that kind of internal pressure that keeps you in while you're still in. And then as people some people who do start to question and realize they have to make this very, very hard decision, because they understand that you're either in or you're out with some of these groups. And so if you're making the decision to go out, you're going to face basically excommunication, and not just from God, the God that you have believed in, but also from the community. So ostracism that comes with that. Then there's things like you might be denied access to your children in certain faiths. But then along the spectrum are violent threats, which certainly Khadija would say is there all the way through in the mind of the Muslim, that there's a kind of possibility of violence against you if you question, if you leave, and then actual violence. So there's this kind of long spectrum, and we could draw a sharp line between violence and non-violence, but I thought it was quite useful to think about those things all together, because it's beyond way beyond my experience as a Methodist. Raised as a Methodist, just wasn't a
Yeah,
question.
the Methodists have never been too high
No.
controlling, although they don't like alcohol.
No, or bingo. You can't do bingo.
Yeah.
But apart from that,
But evangelical Christianity was in there. Conservative, not always conservative evangelical, but some evangelical Christianity can be very high control.
yes, yes,
Um,
yes.
and I thought the point that was made was that different churches can be very different as well, because they're certainly on that wing of the church, it tends not to be as conformist, if you will, across different churches, and very much the doctrines and the emphasis is driven by the vicar in charge or the rector. So they're sort of multifaceted versions of that.
Yeah. And I suppose
But
they can become, if they become quite sort of insular, like a small group, can become quite peculiar and then more cult-like, I presume. There's that
yeah,
freedom, the
yeah.
capacity for that to happen. Yeah. One something that somebody from the audience raised, which is, I think it was the first point from the audience, was how particularly with Islam, but maybe that applies to other faiths as well, that the representatives that are selected by those outside of the faith, the institutions, will choose as representative of that community leaders who are often the most religious. So it will be a religious leader who's representative of a community, and that's a real problem for people that are leaving, have left. So the woman who spoke said that she was in her workplace, and I can't remember. There was somebody who was there who was like an imam, and she's a former Muslim, and she was sort of sidelined as a sort of non-representative Muslim, and he was the one that was brought to the fore as somehow much more representative of a kind of diversity, and she was sort of completely invisibilized as a minority. So that was, I thought that was,
You don't get into the corporate magazine picture of diversity and inclusion if you don't fit the presuppositions of those on the
mm,
board,
mm,
or of those reading that corporate
yeah,
magazine. And when I heard that, I also took that away. It really rammed home this idea that the EDI thing so often, not always, but so often, really is such a cartoon way, isn't it, of looking at the world. It's, if you don't fit this picture of the Muslim, the Christian, the whatever it is, the ethnic minority, if you're a bit different, you're not the thing that people think of when they say those words, you're not going to get in the corporate magazine. You're not going to be on the front. I was going to say that on the window ledge. You're not going to be the one that they put out on display as representative. And I thought that was very telling, actually, that people had actually felt that.
yeah. And I think probably in the earlier stages of it, it was a bit more racialized. So it would be about, let's have a selection of skin colors in the company photograph. But I think as time's gone on, there has been the kind of Islamophobia pressure has come to reach a point where you need a hijabi. So somebody wearing a hijab needs to be the person who represents diversity amongst the various other things that are supposed to be there. So it's very different, because that's obviously a choice within. It's not an ethnicity. It's about a choice that people are making.
One other thing, Jan, is I thought that we could only get questions in the room because of the nature of what we could do technologically last Wednesday. But it was one of those events where I would have loved to have got some of the online questions, because the online questions have the advantage of being voted up or voted down. So what you find is a very natural progression of the most pertinent questions from amongst 400 people get bubble to the top, and that can really help those events. But am I right, Jan, that event is now on YouTube or is about to go on YouTube. So it will be on YouTube for members
by the end of
some point
by
soon.
the end of this week, it will be up. So in the newsletter on Friday that goes to members, they will have a link to where they can go and look at it. I think we'll probably put it on YouTube for everybody to see, actually. So when our monthly newsletter goes out on Monday, the beginning of April, that goes to supporters as well, then they'll have the link, the YouTube link. Anybody can go and find it on our YouTube channel. It's definitely worth a watch. It's really good.
Definitely worth a watch. We've just scratched the surface, haven't we, in what we've just discussed. There's so much in that video and so much that was there in that event. But the big news for the week we've just had is that of a member of the Free Speech Union called Rick Pryor. And a special email was actually sent out last week when we launched Rick Pryor's crowdfunder. Now, what has happened here is Rick Pryor was the chairman, or is the chairman, of the Metropolitan Police Federation, but he was cancelled. And he was cancelled because of what he said in October 2024 for an interview on GB News. And what he said, amongst other things, was that he said the following: there's a striking crisis of confidence at the moment within policing in general, and certainly within the Met Police, whereby officers are withdrawing from any kind of proactive policing for fear of falling foul of the IOPC, that's the Independent Office for Police Conduct, or a vexatious or malicious complaint. There seems to be an assumption of racism right from the off. And what happened is that he was suspended. Rick Pryor was suspended from his post by the Police Federation of England and Wales, the PFEW, which claimed that his comments were supposedly discriminatory. He was also locked out of his emails. He was locked out of the IT system. And he was also told not to speak to the press or to comment on social media. Now, this is such obviously a free expression issue. It's an elected position. So he's not an ordinary employee, which means that the way to get recourse is via a judicial review. It's actually a very expensive process, as we know from our own judicial review against Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, when she stopped the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act progressing back at the end of July 2024. So we're backing Rick Pryor in terms of helping him with the crowdfund and helping him source good legal support against the Police Federation of England and Wales. And as Rick Pryor himself has said, freedom of speech is the bedrock of a democratic society. I was suspended because I dared to speak the truth of what members I represent have been telling me for months. So, Jen, I mean, I'll hand over to you in a sec for your thoughts, but what really struck me was that we switched the crowdfunder on last Thursday, I think it was. A couple of people found it early. I don't know how they did that. We'd switched it on to check the page was working, and already we had a couple of donations come in, which was great, of course, but it was quite, how did you find the page? We haven't publicized it. But then we did publicize the page, and we managed to get to £47,000, I think, on day one, well over £50,000 across days 1 and 2. And over the weekend, I was watching it. It's still sort of a grand a day coming in. We set a target for £100,000, given all of the uncertainty around the cost of judicial review. But one of the things I've seen in the background, Jen, because I'm looking at this, we're analyzing the information as it comes in, is that I get to see the comments, and I've shared them with Toby, obviously all anonymized so that no one can be identified. But so many of these comments, all of support, obviously, for Rick Pryor and what he's going through, so many of them are from ex-police officers or current serving police officers who really underline the point that Rick was making. This is something that police officers are worried about. And there's an absolute indignation that someone who represents them as best they can be represented, because police officers can't actually formally unionize, as I understand it, but the PFEW is the closest they get to that. This is their forum for saying what they need to say, and that's being shut down. So real indignation. And even one of the comments said, "I'm more of a customer than I am, a supporter of the police over the years, having been on the wrong side of the law a few times. But nevertheless, I still believe in what our bobbies are all about, and so here's some money to support Rick. That one actually really did make me smile. This is something that, as it were, is getting people going on all sides of the debate as to whether we should follow the law or not. So I thought that the comments, and they really are touching, the comments, and as I said, I've shared them with Toby. They're all anonymized, and he's fed them back to Rick. But I think it was over 500 comments that we had come in, along with that nearly £50,000 in day one. So, Jan, I don't know what your thoughts are on this. This very bad news, but incredibly good news that we have so much support out there for Rick.
Yes, I mean, it is very interesting, isn't it? It's this sort of disjuncture between Rick's position, presumably elected position as chairman of the Metropolitan Police Federation, and then being subject to discipline by the Police Federation of England and Wales, the national level of the staff association. And that's very worrying, isn't it? That it's this thing we see all the time, this kind of move away from the democratic process, and the concerns of those who are electing their representatives are suppressed and discarded by those at the higher levels. And it's kind of what's going on at every sort of democratic or pseudo-democratic part of our society at the moment. So I think it's a really, really, in principle, regardless of what you think about the police or what you think on the kind of issue of the policing and racism accusations, all of those kinds of things, I think just in terms of independence and democratic process within organisations that are run on that basis, then I think it's a really important thing that we stand up for principle here and for process. So that's really, really good. And then I suppose the second level of this is that policing is just such a huge issue at the moment, and it's one of these ones, a bit like lots of other issues, where a lot of people are moving from where they would have been. So you have people that would always have been very critical of the police, and particularly around things like race, so the policing of black communities, for example, or black people generally, and lots of people that I would know, have had experiences over the years that you wouldn't say were particularly exemplary when it comes to policing. However, they nevertheless recognise the need for a police force that is well-trained, professional, understands the law, and is fearless. And I was talking to a former police officer fairly recently, and he's just left, and he was saying that basically we're saying what Rick's saying, which is it's become very, very difficult for police officers to do their job because they're fearful not just of being disciplined, but more importantly of criminal sanction against them. So this is what this case kind of hinges on, because that's what Rick was talking about, was the case whereby a police officer who had arrested a mother, and I think a controversial case, a mother with her child getting off a bus in London. They were checking tickets, whether people had paid. It turned out she had, but she ended up in handcuffs with her very young child being kind of hysterical nearby, and obviously it was all on video. So, but the officer wasn't just that it was disciplinary action; he was actually criminally sanctioned, and taken rather like the other case in London of the officer who shot dead Chris Cabba, who was ramming police officers. So is that idea of sort of subjecting the police to criminal proceedings, which in some cases you might say that's absolutely appropriate, but in other cases you don't want that to be the thing that's hanging over police all the time. But then you need confidence in their internal disciplinary processes. But that it's a perfectly legitimate thing, I would say, for a representative of police officers to speak on and to speak about in public. And the idea that would somehow be seen as inappropriate and something that needs to be investigated is just ridiculous and very worrying.
It's worth quoting Lord Toby Young as well. So this has been written up in the Telegraph, and Toby is quoted in that. And you know me, Jan, I always love a quote that gets straight to the nub of the issue, to the point. So Lord Young said, the way Rick has been treated is a disgrace. He spoke up for frontline officers in his capacity as the chairman of the Metropolitan Police Federation, voicing their concerns about not being able to do their job without fear or favour, and has been gagged and prevented from running for re-election. It's the kind of thing you'd expect to happen in a banana republic, not the birthplace of parliamentary democracy. Sir Robert Peel will be spinning in his grave. Coming straight back to your point about democracy there, I think, Jan, which is spot on.
Yeah.
And a problem we've seen in local council similarly, as you say, every level of democracy we've seen this inability to understand that actually the scope for debate and political debate actually needs to be as wide as it possibly can be, and there's particular protections around political debate and the ability to take part in political debate. And this is clearly a political position. It's an elected position. So, great quote from Toby, as ever. Now, you mentioned that we have a couple of events on policing coming up. Is that right, Jan?
Yes, so imminently, later in April. So we've got our Belfast Speakeasy, which I've mentioned before, but that is even more prescient when talking about the Rick Pryor case. But although it's Northern Ireland, which will have different issues of policing, we've got Harry Miller speaking, who people will know was formerly a police officer, and then set up Fair Cop, which focuses attention on police not understanding the law. And so he's very critical of the police, but not all police. So he's making lots of distinctions there. But that is focused on policing tweets or policing streets. And so it's about obviously, it's fairly obvious what it's about. It's about non-crime hate incidents. It's about, what are the police doing if they're not catching criminals and phone thieves and burglars and car thieves and all of that, and people who engage in violence. What are they doing, and how on earth have they possibly got the time to knock on people's doors about tweets? So is one of probably the central plank of that particular speakeasy on the 11th of April in Belfast. But we'll also cover other things as well. We've got Tom Slater, who's the editor of Spike. So I think he and Harry and the other panelist, Jenny Holland, will be looking to talk about all kinds of things that are in the news, and policing will be one of the focuses of that. And then a second event, which we've just put up on our website last week, is in Edinburgh on the 30th of April. And that is focusing on policing priorities in Scotland. So we did an event a year ago about the hate crime legislation, just a month down the line after it had been enacted, to sort of say how it might end up working. And I think one of the predictions at the time, which was very interesting, was that it would probably most likely be used against people who were already encountering the law. So people who are homeless, people who are mentally troubled, out on the streets, who are already very exposed and may well be subject to police action, reasonably, probably some of the time, maybe sometimes not. But because of their lesser control perhaps over their language, they might well be subject to further prosecution on the grounds of hate crime, which wasn't really what lots of people were imagining, I don't think, when we talked about hate crime. And obviously it will also apply and act as a chilling effect for lots of other people as well, who are just tweeting or engaging in public life. So we've got Lord Keith Stewart Casey, who was Advocate General for Scotland. So he was advising the government, the national government, on the law, Scottish law. And then we've got Neil Hay, who works quite closely with us. He's a head of a law firm who started working with us around hate crime legislation. And also Callum Steele, who's the ex-General Secretary of the Scottish Police Federation, which I haven't looked into exactly its relationship with the Police Federation of England and Wales, but to me that sounds like that's the equivalent. So that will be very interesting to get his perspective. And Callum, I know, writes quite a lot in the Scottish press about policing and policing priorities. So I think that will be a really, really, really good in-depth discussion where people can hear from the horse's mouth what is going on with the Scottish police force, but also ask questions about how the law is being understood and interpreted and enacted and what it might mean for them. So that will be really good. And that's on the 28th of April. So people can get tickets by going to our website and just looking at the events section.
It's a really interesting point you make, and I'm sure will be covered in more detail at that event, this idea that when we are letting hate crime balloon and actually real crime becomes less, well, not less important, but seen to be less important, it is people on neurodiverse scales who fall foul of speech laws all the time. We see it with EDI in the workplace. Surprise, surprise, people who struggle to put things into words and to say what they mean succinctly and have all of that vocabulary at their fingertips and struggle with that, say it wrong and get into trouble for it. And it is, as you say, exactly the sort of people who should not be finding themselves, on the wrong side of the law at all, because they're struggling to get on in society, and struggling to do the right thing often, very often actually, and just can't say it in quite the right way. So I think that'll be really interesting, and I think there's a whole theme there about how so much of this is actually quite discriminatory against people who are neurodiverse or autistic or whatever it might be on whichever scale.
I suppose it's about who's policeable.
Mm.
And, because the other argument, of course, going on in parallel with this is that the police are retreating from the hard end of
Yeah.
policing. So then they're going to pay their attention to other people, I suppose,
Yeah.
who might well then be easier to police. So you can just knock on their door because they're at home rather than wandering the streets at 2 o'clock in the morning looking to break into
Like that grandmother.
somebody's window.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
The Online Safety Act, Jan, has reared its ugly head again this week. And we say ugly head because we've been fighting a battle against some very important elements of this, which have been things like forcing social media companies to remove awful but lawful, legal but harmful items from their platforms. And although we did manage to strike out some really the most egregious things, it still has given a lot of power to organizations like Ofcom to set up new guidelines and new rules and regulations of the road. And the key thing that has happened in the last 7 days is that on Monday, the 17th of March, the latest phase of duties came into force on pain of massive fines. And what social media companies and platforms and whatnot have to do now is identify and remove illegal content under the illegal harms duties. They must complete risk assessments detailing how they will deal with illegal material and implement safety measures to deal with the risk. So there's a whole layer now of burden, bureaucracy, which if you're a big social media company, that's irritating. You might need to hire a few more people, but you can manage it. But if you are a very, very small forum, or if you are a very, very small business, then that really is almost too much. And it was reported in the Telegraph this last week that dozens of small internet forums have already blocked British users, or in fact completely shut down, as these new online safety laws have come into effect. And it's been described in the press, in some quarters, as our version, a British version of China's Great Firewall. Now, I only came across that term a few years ago when I sent a team member into China when I was still working as an actuary, and we had a Chinese office. And I said, "Oh, you should go to China and go and meet our colleagues and see what's going on the ground. Tell me how we're pricing our business out there, what our opportunities for making more money might be." And it was only when he was in Beijing, I was talking to him, and he said, "Oh, it's the Great Firewall. We can't do this, and we can't." What's the Great Firewall? I'd never heard of it. And it is essentially that there is a real clampdown on which internet sites you can go on, what's available, what's not available in China. So that was a completely new idea to me. That was back in 2018, I think it was. But what this now is saying is that effectively this new law is making us, Britain, our little island, surrounded by a great firewall. And I tested it out, Jan. I think I was telling you before we click record. I went to one of these forums. Obviously, I couldn't go to the one that's already been shut down because it's been shut down. But I went to one of the small ones that was blocking British users. And it's absolutely the case. It said, because of the new duties under the Online Safety Act, this is now being blocked, and they're very innocuous topics. I mean, one that was shut down was on hamsters, for goodness sake. So I mean, I've never met a hamster
The
that should
darker
get us.
side of hamsters.
Yeah, the ferocious hamster. Yeah, even children love hamsters. But I went to the one that was blocking British users, and it said, yeah, "You're in Britain. You can't. And I thought, well, hang on, I've got a VPN, so I switched the VPN on. I routed it through Switzerland, went back to the forum, and I could get in. So it's also silly. It's also very, very stupid, because you can bypass this if you know a little bit, and I don't know very much at all, and it worked for me. So and it's all of this burden that's come in. It's all of this new stuff, and the free expression element here, Jan, is that people who just want to run small internet forums to chat about things, to talk about their hobbies, their interests, they can't do it, or it's not worth the risk anymore. And you know, the idea of becoming an island that has this great British firewall, online firewall, is horrible. It really kind of just makes me think we're turning into a version of China, and suffering from the same state control. Indirectly, it may be, but it still leads to the same effect, but for slightly different reasons. So I don't know what you felt about this story, Jan.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of hamsters. I mean, they're very bitey and quite
It
violent.
was my first
However,
pet.
yeah, mine too. It's
And
from
I'm not going to give
direct
away the name, because
experience.
then you have passwords to all my bank accounts.
From direct experience, they're nasty little whatevers. However, I do think people should be able to be fans of them online. So, but I think that the thing that really you can kind of see happening here is, obviously the intention is not to shut down hamster forums, but what it prepares all the ground for is that when serious political discord needs to be expressed, that will also get trapped in within these kinds of net. What do you call, well, a net
Yeah.
that can sort of squeeze out, and be very directly controlled, which yeah, is very worrying. And it came up that an issue related to online safety came up at the apostasy event we were talking about earlier, because and I know Ben explained this to me, which is that the importance of anonymity, online anonymity, for people who've left high control religions, as they need to be able to communicate with each other and find support and information, especially as they're leaving, because they know nothing about the outside world. And so the online world is a way in which they can find information and vital support that can help them make that move. But in order to do that, they have to be able to be anonymous. And so when these talk is had of removing online anonymity, which in some respects we sort of think, oh, that sounds like a good thing, but actually it's got really, really serious repercussions that need to be thought through. And I think the thing that happens all the time is that social media is the kind of go-to um, thing to blame by politicians, celebrities, public figures. And it's just so easy, because what they're saying is life is messy, there's evil out there, and we need to be able to suppress it. But of course, they go to the only place they can think of where you could actually try to eliminate evil, and that's the internet. And all human life is there on the internet. So it's really, you can see this with this discussion this week about the adolescence Netflix series, which I watched over the weekend. And although it's it's an interesting drama, it's really quite well done, but all of the kind of amplification of it is, oh my god, it's all about social media and young boys and Andrew Tate and incel culture, and what we must do is this: we must ban phones, and we must, and it's a very simple-minded approach to really complex social problems that's very frustrating. And whenever you hear a politician speak, they'll short circuit any discussion of a big social problem to a social media issue very, very quickly. And then you don't really get anywhere else with it. It just becomes an argument for restrictions rather than properly considering, for example, what's going on in the relationships between young people, or between parents and young people, teachers and young people. Those much more difficult questions are always just bypassed because you have a technical solution, apparently, which obviously won't work. It will just remove everybody else's freedom.
There was a
So it's very,
moment during last week's panel discussion where they were saying, one of the panel members was saying, someone can leave this faith and they think they're the only person in that mosque, for example, who's ever left the faith. Actually, they may think they're the only person in that town who's ever left the faith. Actually, they may think they're the only person ever, and she built it out, in history to leave the faith or to have these thoughts of leaving the faith. And so when you're starting with that mindset of that level of control of your understanding of why you might be having these doubts and that loneliness, that isolation, yes, the social media is the lifeline. It's a cliche, but it's the lifeline. You find other like-minded people. You build up the courage step by step. You discover things about the broader, bigger, wonderful world of complexity and multiple textures and multiple ways of living your life. And that comes from online when you are physically trapped in a situation. So I think you're absolutely right. It was such a powerful point that was made, actually.
Yeah, and that drive for freedom and the way in which, I mean, that is the thing of, if you see the internet as, well, rather social media anyway, is a place where humans connect and express themselves, then obviously there's going to be all the negative and all the positive you could possibly have. But certainly the freedom aspect of it is incredibly important. And the attempt to induce fear of the outside world, which is what people described as kind of absolutely the norm within those faiths, that fear of the outside world as being toxic, as being sinful, and that you must stay in and stay safe amongst your own community, and that even, sort of expressing yourself is something you ought to fear as well, because you need to control your own thoughts to such an extent that you mustn't allow doubt. So I think that, when you think deeply about those questions of freedom and the individual and how they might conflict with community, how we all need community, all those kind of big questions and fear, then you can arrive at much more interesting solutions to problems that will be caused by social media, like, for example, kids on their phones in school all day. What do we do about that? That clearly is a daft thing to allow kids to do. In the sense it's never happened before, it was never necessary before. When you see them do it, it looks clearly disruptive. So, but that doesn't mean you need to shut down the whole of social media, even to children.
That's a beautiful segue, Jan. You've linked the beginning of the episode with the end, with our last item perfectly, and I don't think I can improve on that at all. So, unless you have anything else to say, I think that's a wrap as far as this episode is concerned.
That's it from
That's
me
it.
as well. I like to end with a bit of flattery from you to me. That's great.
Yeah, no, you never trust a flatterer.
No, it's true. Well, I believe it for an hour or so. It boosts my Monday.
Well, we wish everyone a wonderful week, and we will speak to you next week. But bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.